Let me tell you something about the judicial system. It was designed to protect the innocent, punish the guilty, and maintain order in a civilized society. It was not designed to be your personal concierge service. And it certainly wasn't designed to be a weapon you can wield just because your boyfriend dumped you and you don't feel like packing your bags. Every single day, people walk into courthouses across this country and lie under oath to get a temporary restraining order. They use a piece of paper meant to save lives as a free pass to steal a house. It is despicable. It makes a mockery of real victims of domestic violence. And when I catch someone doing it in my courtroom, I don't just get mad. I get even. Enter Chloe Barrett. She is the defendant in today's case, standing at the podium wearing a smirk she probably thought was charming and a cheap polyester blazer she probably bought just for this appearance. She has the posture of a woman who believes she is the smartest person in any room she walks into. I see people like her all the time. They read one paragraph of a legal blog on the internet and suddenly think they are Clarence Darrow. Standing opposite her is the plaintiff, Greg Thorne. Greg is a 32-year-old engineer who looks like he has aged 10 years in the last 3 months. He has dark circles under his eyes, his shoulders are slumped, and he is clutching a manila folder so tightly his knuckles are white. Greg is suing his ex-girlfriend for $5,000, the maximum allowed in this court. He is suing for the cost of a hotel room he was forced to live in for a month, property damage to his home, and the value of personal items that mysteriously sprouted legs and walked away while he was legally barred from entering his own property. Chloe, naturally, is countersuing for $5,000 for relocation expenses and emotional distress, because of course she is. In her mind, the fact that the gravy train derailed means she is entitled to a severance package. Mr. Thorne, I began looking over the top of my glasses at him. Let's establish the baseline facts before we get into the theatrics. You own a 3-bedroom house on Elm Street. Your name is on the deed. Your name is on the mortgage. You bought it 3 years ago, before you ever met the defendant. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, Greg said, his voice steady but carrying the unmistakable weight of utter exhaustion. I bought the house in 2021. I met Chloe a year later, and she moved in with you, I said, flipping to the next page of my file. Did she pay rent? No, Your Honor. She told me she was in between jobs and just needed a few months to get back on her feet, but she never got a job. I paid the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, everything. For 2 years, I shifted my gaze to Chloe. She was already rolling her eyes, resting her weight on one hip, like a bored teenager waiting for the school bell to ring. Miss Barrett, I snapped, and her head jerked up. Stand up straight. You are not at a bus stop. You are in a courtroom. Did you pay rent during the 2 years you lived in Mr. Thorne's house? I contributed in other ways, Judge, she said smoothly, with that practiced, honey-sweet voice that manipulators always use when they are trying to play the victim. I kept the house clean. I cooked. I offered emotional support. I didn't ask if you fluffed his pillows, I interrupted, my voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. I asked if you paid rent. Did you write a check, hand him cash, or transfer legal tender to his bank account for the privilege of living under his roof? No, she admitted, her jaw tightening slightly. No, I repeated. So, you were a guest. A very long-term, very expensive guest. Mr. Thorne, 3 months ago, you decided you had enough of this arrangement. You broke up with her. What happened next? Greg took a deep breath, opening his manila folder. I told her it wasn't working out. I told her I wanted her to move out. I was trying to be fair, Your Honor, so I gave her a written 30-day notice. I even offered to pay her first month's rent at a new apartment just to help her transition out. I looked at the copy of the notice in his file. It was perfectly legal, perfectly reasonable, and frankly, far more generous than she deserved. You gave her 30 days, I said, tracing the timeline with my pen, and according to your complaint, on day 29, the day before she was legally obligated to vacate your property, the police showed up at your door. Why? Because she filed a temporary ex parte restraining order against me, Greg said, the anger finally bleeding into his voice. I came home from work and there were 2 squad cars in my driveway. The officers handed me a piece of paper, told me I had 15 minutes to pack a bag, and forced me to leave my own house. They told me if I came within 500 feet of the property, I would be arrested. I leaned back in my chair, staring at Chloe. This is the part that makes my blood boil. The ex parte system is designed for emergencies. It means a judge grants a temporary order based solely on the sworn statement of one party without hearing from the other side because there is an immediate threat of violence. It is a necessary tool to protect people from domestic abuse. But when it is weaponized by a bitter freeloader who just doesn't want to pack her bags, it is a gross abuse of the law. Miss Barrett, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, you lived in this man's house for 2 years. He breaks up with you. He gives you 30 days to leave. He offers to pay for your new apartment. And on the 29th day, you run to a courthouse and swear under oath that you are in imminent physical danger. What exactly did he do to put you in such terror for your life? Chloe adjusted her collar, looking entirely unbothered. He was becoming increasingly hostile, Your Honor. He was yelling at me, slamming doors. I didn't feel safe. I felt threatened. The law says if I feel threatened, I have a right to protect myself. The law does not care about your feelings, Madam, I barked, slamming my hand down on the desk. The law cares about facts. Did he strike you? No, but did he threaten to strike you? He was intimidating me, she argued, her voice rising. Did he threaten to strike you? Yes or no? I demanded, leaning over the bench. No, she muttered, crossing her arms defensively. Did you call the police at any point during those 29 days? I pressed, relentless. Did you file a police report for domestic disturbance, harassment, or assault? I didn't think I needed to, she deflected. I went straight to the court. Of course you did, I said, dripping with sarcasm. Because the police would have actually investigated. The police would have asked questions. But if you walk into a courthouse and cry to a clerk, you get a temporary order signed by a judge who has to err on the side of caution. You didn't file that order because you were scared, Miss Barrett. You filed it because you didn't have a new apartment lined up, and you figured out a brilliant little loophole to get him kicked out of his own house so you could stay. I was trying to survive, Judge, Chloe declared loudly, throwing her hands up in a gesture of exaggerated helplessness. It was a terrible performance, truly D-list acting. I had nowhere to go. He was throwing me out on the street, and he was being so aggressive about it. I was practically a battered woman, emotionally speaking. The entire courtroom went dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Even Bird raised his eyebrows and turned slowly to look at her, a mixture of disbelief and pure disgust on his face. I took off my glasses. I placed them carefully on the desk. I stood up slowly, leaning my knuckles against the worn wood of the bench. Did you just use the phrase, practically a battered woman? Emotionally speaking? I asked, my voice low and dangerous, trembling with an anger that was entirely real. Chloe, completely tone-deaf to the temperature of the room, nodded defensively. Yes, emotional abuse is just as bad as physical abuse, Your Honor. I read an article about it. You read an article, I repeated softly, the silence in the room stretching tight like a rubber band about to snap. And then it snapped. Madam, there are women who come into this courtroom who have had their orbital bones shattered. I roared, my voice echoing off the high ceiling. There are women who sleep in their cars with their children because if they go home, they will be beaten within an inch of their lives. There are people who use the restraining order system to stay alive. And you dare stand in front of me in a court of law and compare a man asking you to leave his house after 2 years of paying your bills to being a battered woman? Chloe physically recoiled, taking a step back from the podium as if I had struck her. Her face went pale, the smugness completely vanishing. You are a disgrace, I continued, pointing a finger directly at her chest. You are an absolute unmitigated disgrace to every genuine victim of domestic violence who desperately needs the protection of the court. You weaponized a system designed to save lives because you were too lazy to pack your bags and find a job. I slammed my hand down on the desk, the sharp crack making her flinch. You committed perjury. You went to a judge, swore under oath that you were in imminent danger, and stole a man's home out from under him. And you did it on the 29th day of a 30-day notice. That is not survival. That is a calculated, malicious, fraudulent eviction. I turned back to Greg. He was standing perfectly still, watching the dismantling of the woman who had tormented him for months. I could see the relief washing over him, the validation he had been desperate for since the day the police forced him out of his own driveway. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice returning to a brisk, businesslike tone, "let's review the damages. You were locked out of your own home by law for 30 days while waiting for the permanent restraining order hearing. What did you do?" Greg cleared his throat, opening his folder again. "I had nowhere to go, Your Honor. My family lives out of state. I couldn't afford to rent an apartment on short notice because I was still paying the mortgage on the house she was living in. So I had to stay at a motel down by the highway." He handed a stack of receipts to Bird, who brought them up to the bench. I flipped through them, 30 nights at a cheap motel, totaling $1,800. "You spent a month living in a motel," I noted, looking at the dates, "while she was living in your house, free of charge." "Yes, Your Honor," Greg said softly. "And during that month, I continued," referencing his complaint, "you continued to pay the utilities, the electricity, the water, the gas. I legally had to," Greg explained. "My lawyer told me that if I shut off the utilities while she had a temporary restraining order granting her possession of the home, it would be considered an illegal self-help eviction and I could go to jail." I nodded slowly, looking over at Chloe, who was now staring intently at the floor. "That is correct. You were given good legal advice. The system forces the property owner to maintain the property while the freeloader sits inside watching cable television on your dime." I turned the page in my file. "Now, let's fast forward to the permanent hearing. 30 days later, you go to court to fight this temporary order. What happened?" "The judge threw it out immediately," Greg said, his voice finally gaining some strength. "It didn't even last 10 minutes. Her story fell apart the second he asked for proof of abuse. He told her she had abused the system and ordered the temporary restraining order dismissed. I was finally allowed to go back to my house. And when you returned to your property, I said, anticipating the answer, because I have seen this exact scenario play out 100 times. What did you find?" Greg let out a long, heavy sigh. "She was gone, Your Honor. She packed up all her stuff and left. But she didn't just take her stuff. She took the television in the living room. She took my coffee maker. She took my grandmother's antique mirror from the hallway. And the house was completely trashed." He handed another stack of photographs to Bird. I looked through them carefully. It looked like a frat house after a 3-day bender. There were stains on the carpets, holes punched in the drywall, garbage piled up in the kitchen, and, true to his word, empty spaces where electronics used to be. I looked up over my glasses at Chloe. "Miss Barrett, did you take this man's television?" "It was a gift," she muttered defensively, still not looking me in the eye. "It was a gift," I repeated flatly. A 65-inch flat-screen television was a gift. "When did he give it to you?" "When he bought it for the living room," she argued. "He said, 'Look what I got us.' Us. That means it was half mine. So I took my half." I honestly couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement of this woman was staggering. "Madam," I said, leaning forward, "unless you took a chainsaw and cut the television perfectly in half down the middle, you didn't take your half. You stole his television. Did you also take his grandmother's antique mirror?" "I liked it," she said simply, as if that was a perfectly valid legal defense. "It looked good in my new apartment." "You liked it?" I said. my voice completely devoid of emotion. I was beyond anger at this point. I was dealing with a criminal who didn't even realize she was confessing to grand larceny in a civil courtroom. And what about the coffee maker? Was that a gift too? He doesn't even drink coffee, she snapped, suddenly finding her nerve again. I'm the only one who used it. Why should he get to keep it? Because he paid for it. You simpleton, I roared, slamming my hand down on the desk again. Because it was inside his house. Because you are a thief.